Now, in this lecture, we are going to talk about two different topics that are related: occupational exposure limits and occupational exposure assessment strategies. It is very important to understand the relationship between these two because occupational exposure limits are a fairly significant component of any exposure assessment strategy. And as we will discuss a little bit later, some of the exposure assessment strategies in the past have depended on people's interpretations of what these exposure limits meant. In the first section now, we're going to talk about occupational exposure limits and the considerations, issues, and insights relating to this. Most industrial hygiene practitioners view an occupational exposure limit, or OEL, as just a number. However, it is actually a complex parameter that requires us to understand how that particular exposure limit number was derived. What are the data supporting the limit? What are the health points that were considered when that particular OEL was assigned? And where are the uncertainty factors coming from in our interpretation of the OEL? What were the safety factors included when setting a particular number as the OEL? And then how far can we extrapolate this value, if at all? And finally, what are the various methods available to apply the OEL to an exposure scenario where the exposure is a distribution rather than a specific value? What is the relationship between an OEL and a health risk? The health risk from a particular environmental hazard is a function both of the hazard and its exposure. So the health risk due to a chemical or due to an occupational hazard is a function both of the hazard and the human exposure to that particular hazard. And an occupational exposure limit is used to characterize the hazard term. And the challenge is to establish OELs that are protective for most individuals, while at the same time not imposing undue restrictions on workers' ability to complete the duties associated with their jobs, or aggravate or increase other risks that could impose other forms of physical, social, or financial harm. The interpretation of the exposure assessment data as we compare it to the OEL is also dependent on the reasons or purposes of conducting the exposure assessment. So what are the different purposes of an exposure assessment? The first, it could be that we want to see if we are in compliance with health-based exposure limits. And are all the workers being protected? Is the workers' well-being being assured? The second possible reason for conducting an exposure assessment is compliance with governmental regulations. So the first two are somewhat related. The third possible reason is that there is a chemical approval program within an institution or a company that wants to identify the requirements associated with introducing this new agent into a workplace. The fourth could be, what are the personal protective equipment requirements for a particular group of workers using a particular chemical or a particular agent? How can we properly select the appropriate respiratory protection for a particular exposure scenario? We also might want to assess the impact of a process change, the introduction of a new process, or the impact of work practice changes. You may want to understand the ventilation requirements associated with the introduction of new material or changes in the process or work practices. The exposure assessment can support process hazard reviews, support accident or illness investigations. It can assess the potential for upsets in the production and the impact of such upsets. It helps us do emergency planning, and also, finally, the purpose of the exposure assessment could be to retrospectively assess exposures that happened a long time ago. And these could be for epidemiological studies where the exposures might have happened in the past, but the health outcomes are becoming apparent only now. These kinds of retrospective exposure assessments can also be done for legal cases, toxic torts as they're called, and also for assessing illness clusters. Not all occupational exposures are equivalent. And the differences between OELs could be because of the spectrum of data that are used to establish the OEL. For example, some data could be from in vitro studies. That means from cells or tissues being exposed to the harmful agent. Some could come from animal studies, from mice to rats to larger and larger mammals, or they could come from human studies. And so these different types of data have different levels of validity to them. The experience and the knowledge of the individuals setting the OEL also plays a role. The methodology applied by the individuals or the institutions establishing the OEL, the health points that were considered in setting the OEL, the safety factors applied, and the inclusion or exclusion of technical, analytical, and economic feasibility considerations. So a health-based exposure limit might be very stringent for a particular agent, and an institution or an individual might set a very low exposure limit. Whereas if economic feasibility considerations were included, then the OEL that is arrived at might not be as stringent, and you might have a slightly higher exposure limit. There are also data uncertainty or data limitations that go into setting an exposure limit. So if there is a relatively new chemical, the institution would not have had the opportunity to include animal or human data in its consideration while setting an OEL. And so there is a certain amount of uncertainty in the health effects that this particular agent might cause. And we need to be aware of that. Finally, while setting an OEL, the use of direct information or information from analogous agents would be very useful. Because some chemicals, even though they are different from each other, they act in a similar way. And so that kind of insight would be very useful in setting an exposure limit for a new agent. What are some of the sources of OELs? There are a variety of sources, and in the next few slides, I'll talk about a few of them. The first kind are what are called regulations, either federal regulations or international consensus standards. And many of these consider technical and economic feasibility while setting them. So the OSHA, that is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, this is a federal agency. And this agency sets these exposure limits that are called PELs, or permissible exposure limits. And these have a legal weight to them. And these do include considerations of technical and economic feasibility when they were set. So the next one is the American National Standards Institute standards. And these are also consensus standards. And then finally, we have the derived no effect levels, or DNLs, and these have been used in setting the European Union exposure limits for their REACH regulations. There are also authoritative or health-based exposure limits, and this kind of approach does not include economic or technical feasibility considerations. These are typically set by health scientists, so exposure scientists and toxicologists and physicians and so on. And they do not include definition any economic or technical feasibility, meaning they don't consider whether setting an exposure limit too low might cause economic harm to an industry. Or is it even feasible today with today's technology to reduce exposures to that low of a level in a regular workplace? So such health-based OELs use professional judgment, the toxicological potency of the agents, the mechanisms by which these chemicals are eliminated from the human body, and the significance of the adverse health outcome. The threshold limit values, or TLVs, that are set by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, or ACGIH, are the main example of such health-based exposure limits. And so the ACGIH TLVs, as they're called more commonly, they are one of the most influential sets of exposure limits that are available to us today. In addition, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, has its own set of recommended exposure limits, or RELs, and these are also based on purely health considerations. In addition, there are some other exposure limits that are also based on health effects alone. The American Industrial Hygiene Association, or AIHA, has these workplace environmental exposure limits, or wheels as they're called. These are also based on purely the health outcomes without any consideration for economic or technical feasibility. And then finally, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has listed for a large number of chemicals a reference dose. And these also serve the purpose of exposure limits and are, again, based purely on health effects. A third source of OELs are companies themselves. So there are a large number of companies that are in the business of inventing new chemicals for commercial purpose. And many of them have internal research that is carried out that is solely for the purpose of developing exposure limits. What are the toxic effects of this new chemical that we plan to introduce into the marketplace? And so that is the rationale for developing an in-house exposure limit. And these are developed by the company or the trade organization, but these are also then recommended to customers who buy these. So these could be other companies that buy a particular chemical from the manufacturing company, or it might eventually come down to, if you went to Home Depot to buy this chemical off the shelf, you might be able to read the instructions for the user of that chemical. These are ad hoc. These have not been vetted by scientific organizations, but these are interim exposure limits that have been recommended to customers. In the pharmaceutical industry, there are performance-based exposure limits that are unique to pharmaceutical agents that have very high potency. So many of the chemicals that are used in manufacturing drugs that are intended to have significant effects on human beings, workers who are in these industries could be exposed to them unintentionally. Again, these are internal to the pharmaceutical industry or maybe even just a particular company, and these are called performance-based exposure limits, and they're primarily focused on the pharmaceutical industry.